Steven Pinker is an extraordinary scholar and public intellectual, as reflected in the title of the forthcoming Clio Psyche interview I conducted with him. It is Steven Pinker, a polymath who writes psychohistory. This Harvard University cognitive psychologist is one of the foremost intellectuals of our time. I counted 128 awards on his resume, including 5 for teaching. There are awards from the American Psychological Association, the Academy of Sciences, and various other organizations. Pinker has twice been the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He was named one of the 100 most influential thinkers worldwide by Time magazine in 2004, and the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute of Thought Leaders in 2014. Steve Pinker has written 11 original books, 1 collection of his articles, and edited 4 books, which are mostly collections of articles by others. Pinker's most notable early work argues that the human faculty of language is instinctive, that humans are born with an innate capacity for language. About 2011, I was blown away while reading The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. His argument on 802 pages were so powerful and based on extraordinary arena of factual evidence. It verified what I had been finding as a psychoanalytic historian. This led me to use it as a teaching Western and world civilizations, and to have an ongoing discussion with Ken Fuchsman and others, which appeared in the pages of Clio Psyche in 2014 as a symposium entitled, Are We More or Less Civilized? It's with great pleasure that I welcome our keynote speaker. Good to have you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. And I assume you can all hear me, the question we all have to ask in the age of Zoom.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Paul, for those very kind words. I'm going to speak about a kind of psychohistory that may be have a different flavor than the variety that's common in this conference, growing out of my interest in human nature in general and violence in particular. I'm going to start with a somewhat radical suggestion on how not to understand the past and future of war and other forms of violence, and that is read the news or conventional narrative history, that is a chronicle of events. I've argued as a cognitive psychologist that a series of events, as we read in the news, as we read in most histories, is a systematically misleading way of understanding the world. This is an argument that I put forward in my most recent book, Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. Because it's a pretty well-established fact about the human mind that the way in which we assess risk and probability, as documented by the great cognitive psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, is by a trick or a rule of thumb that they call the availability heuristic. That is, the easier it is to imagine an example, the more likely that kind of event is estimated to be. That is, we use our own memory search engine and the results that it coughs up as a quick and dirty way of assessing probability and risk. The problem is that that means that anything that is salient, memorable, vivid, that easily pops into mind, we tend to think of as common. And it may not be, it may just be memorable. So people fear plane crashes and shark attacks and nuclear accidents, which almost certainly won't kill them, but they don't fear car crashes, collisions with deer, and particulate matter pollution, which very well might kill them. Now, what happens when the availability heuristic is fed by the news or by conventional narrative history, a chronicle of wars and revolutions? Well, news is stuff that happens. It's not stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a headline that says no war has been fought in Vietnam in the last 50 years. You don't see a headline, a particular city has not been attacked by terrorists or by a school shooter. Together with the fact that on top of the inherent bias toward events that the news delivers, it's well known that there is a bias toward the negative in journalism, as captured by the cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. Likewise, narrative history is a chronicle of the worst things that have happened in the history of the world, the wars, the genocides, the revolutions, and there is a bias toward the recent past where the records are better. We just know more about the past century than we do about previous millennia, more details. So more of the violence that has happened recently we know about than violence that happened millennia ago that may have been like a tree falling in the forest with no one to hear it. So if you combine the availability heuristic, with the nature of news and narrative history, you get the impression that the world is more dangerous than it ever has been. And you always get that impression, regardless of the state of the world, because there's never a shortage of disasters as long as they have not fallen to zero, which they never will. The cure for this cognitive bias is obviously data. That is, how many bad things happen as a proportion of the number of opportunities? Has that proportion changed over time? And that's what I tried to do in the book that gave this lecture its title, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And the subtitle captures the result of analyzing history in that way, namely, why violence has declined. So the message of the book is that, believe it or not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time. Now, the decline of violence has not been steady, not been a straight line or even a monotonic function without zigs or zags. It has certainly not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it's not guaranteed to continue. Nothing is guaranteed to continue. But I've tried to show that it's a persistent historical development. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Terrible pollen season, visible on scales from millennia to years, and from wars and genocides to the treatment of children and animals. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about several major historical declines of violence, their immediate causes in terms of particular historical events of the era. But here's where the psychohistory comes in. I also want to talk about their ultimate causes, namely broad historical forces that interact with human brain systems for violence and for nonviolence. And indeed, the title, of course, stolen from Abraham Lincoln, The Better Angels of Our Nature, suggests that presupposes that human nature has numerous angels and devils. That is, that it is a complex system of many forces pushing and pulling, certainly not a foreign conception to this audience, but one that I will develop not in a particularly psychoanalytic way, but from the point of view of modern evolutionary psychology and systems neuroscience, but with definite connections to psychoanalytic conceptions. So the first the historical decline I'll talk about has been called the civilizing process, as symbolized by this woodcut showing a day in the life in the Middle Ages. Here's a graph showing rates of homicide in Europe over the last 700 years or so, and homicide records do go back to the Middle Ages. And what it shows is that in every country for which we have data, rates of homicide have been in decline. Indeed, this is a logarithmic scale from 1/10 of a homicide per year to 1 to 10 to 100 per 100,000 population. So the decline is actually even more dramatic than this graph would indicate. What was the immediate cause? Well, Norbert Elias, himself perhaps one of the first psychohistorians and heavily influenced by psychoanalysis in his time, suggested that in the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of centralized states and kingdoms from the medieval patchwork of principalities and baronies and fiefs and duchies, with the result that criminal justice was nationalized and the constant feuding and brigandage and warlording of medieval knights was replaced by what was called the king's justice. Also, Elias noted there was a growing infrastructure of commerce in the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, the adoption of institutions like money and contracts that made trade possible over larger territories, physical innovations in transportation and timekeeping, like roads and carts. As a result, zero-sum plunder gave rise to positive-sum trade. This is an idea that I'll return to. In particular, the psychohistorical implication was that it called for a strengthening of what we might call the ego, that is, the application of self-control over the instinctive tendency to lash out and defend your honor. But I'll return to that at the end of the talk. The second historical transition refers to the ways that the first kingdoms and states implemented justice in their territories, namely by sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, like breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half from the crotch down, and impalement. But in a process that has been called the Humanitarian Revolution, country after country abolished the use of torture as a form of criminal punishment. Here we have a timeline of a sample of major countries and kingdoms and when they abolished judicial torture, all concentrated really in the 18th century, including our own prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, which took place right in the middle of this global trend. Also taking place during the Humanitarian Revolution was the abolition of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the books, including for poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, those had been reduced to 4. For that matter, capital punishment itself has been abolished by country after country. This is a cumulative timeline of the European countries that have capital punishment on the law books, where the biggest part of the trend has been in the last 60 years or so. But the blue line, which shows the number of European countries that actually execute people, shows the decline began even earlier. European countries began to lose their stomach for executing people even before the politicians got around to striking it from the law books. Now, the United States, in this and many other regards, is an outlier among Western democracies. We still have capital punishment on the books. But even in the United States, we've been losing our taste for putting people to death. And here you see the number of American executions per capita from the colonial times to the present. And even in the last decade, state after state has been either abolishing capital punishment or de facto just not executing anyone. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution like burning heretics, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and of course, most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be practiced by every major civilization. No one seemed to think there was anything wrong with it, as long as you weren't the slaves. The Bible had no problem with slavery. And so-called democratic Athens was a slaveholding society. But in the beginning, in the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions that grew into a flood, with the result that since 1980, when Mauritania became the last country to abolish legal chattel slavery, slavery has been illegal everywhere on Earth in a unique 40-year period of human history, unlike anything before. Well, what were the immediate causes of the Humanitarian Revolution? One candidate was the rise of printing and literacy, that books became cheaper and cheaper and a greater and greater percentage of the population could read. Why should this matter? Well, for one thing, when knowledge replaces superstition and ignorance, we call the process Enlightenment. And a literate and educated populace is less likely to believe in malarkey such as that Jews poison wells, heretics go to hell, crop failures are caused by witches, children are possessed by the devil, Africans are brutish, and that's bound to undermine many rationales for institutional violence. As Voltaire said during this period, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, and this relates again to psychohistory, any force toward cosmopolitanism, like consuming fiction and drama and history and journalism, gets people into the habit of inhabiting other people's minds to imagine what it's like to be them, to expand our circle of empathy. And that is likely to decrease people's tastes for sadism and cruelty as they better imagine themselves in the shoes of other people. The third historical development I'll talk about has been called the long peace. And I'll begin to illustrate it with a few graphs. The first one shows the historical trajectory of great power war. These are what you might even call world wars, that is, clashes between the 800-pound gorillas of the day, the biggest states and empires. And because of the statistical distribution of wars, a few big wars kill more people than lots and lots and lots of little wars. It's the great power wars that are responsible for the lion's share of the deaths. What this graph shows is that 500 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war with each other, but more recently, they have never been at war with each other. In fact, the last great power war, that is, uniformed armies of two great powers meeting each other on the battlefield, was 70 years ago in Korea, pitting the United States against China. I'm going to zoom in now on the 20th century, because although the percentage of time the great powers were at war decreased, there were two massive spikes of bloodletting in the 20th century, corresponding to the First World War and the Second World War. But then an interesting thing happened. After the just spasm of violence in World War II, the wars kind of started to kind of hug the carpet, and there have been a declining number of wars and declining death toll in wars. I'll zoom in even closer now on the period since, zooming in on the period since World War II. And as you can see, after several pretty awful wars, the Korean War and Chinese Civil War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and more recently, this uptick corresponds to the war in Ukraine and the recently concluded civil war in Ethiopia involving the Tigray province. Still, it's taken us back to the late 80s, and we're nowhere near the rates of the 80s, the 70s, or the 50s, to say nothing of the world wars. And indeed, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which is on all of our minds, as it should be, came as a shock because it is a historical anomaly. It pushed against a almost 80-year trend. It's the only interstate war in Europe since World War II, the first interstate war outside the Middle East or Africa in 40 years. And as I mentioned, it brought battle death rates back to the levels of the late 1980s. So this has certainly been a regression, a reversal of the tide of progress against war. And of course, it remains to be seen whether it will get better or worse. Okay, what were the immediate historical causes of the decline of war? Among them that have been hypothesized and supported were the rise of democracy, whereas a dictator or king or supreme leader can drag his country into a war to stoke his own ego. When the cannon fodder get a vote, they may be more squeamish about starting stupid wars of glory. The fact that wealth no longer comes from land and depends less on natural resources. You can have rich countries with no natural resources like Hong Kong and Belgium and Israel. And big countries full of resources that are racked by war, like Congo, simply because of the change in the basis of the economy. The growth of commerce and trade, which makes it, and this is again goes back to Norbert Elias, that when it's cheaper to buy stuff than to steal it because of the growing infrastructure of trade, then there's less of an incentive to invade and plunder. And also in dense networks of commerce, it's stupid to kill your customers, and it's stupid to kill your debtors. And so there's a greater incentive toward cooperation and against violence. The growth of global and regional interstate organizations, the UN, the European Union, and many others, which can put leaders into a club that have certain norms about what you just do or don't do. The fact that interstate war is literally illegal, that all nations that belong to the UN are signatories to an agreement that prohibit the waging of war except for the in self-defense or with the prior approval of the UN Security Council. This is a change from the historical norm, where it was considered perfectly legitimate to resolve a dispute by biting off a chunk of territory and to expect the world community to recognize the conquest. Now, of course, the outlawry of war hasn't eliminated war any more than the outlawry of murder has eliminated murder, but it plausibly has reduced its incidence. The expansion of peacekeeping forces, blue-helmeted UN and other forces that interpose themselves between warring parties and that statistically do have a track record of reducing the incidence of war. And a little more nebulously, but perhaps still effectively, the growth of norms and values that prioritize human life and prosperity over national and religious glory. Again, I'll return to that. Finally, I'll talk about the rights revolutions, such as the civil rights revolution. I'll just give one or two graphs for each one of these rights revolutions. This graph shows the number of lynchings per week in the United States since the 19th century. And what you can see is that 150 years ago, there were about 3 lynchings a week. That has fallen to 0. The kind of racist attitudes that led to lynchings has been in steady decline. For example, the percentage of white Americans who say that Black and white students should go to separate schools, or the percentage of whites who say that they would move out if a Black family moved next door, have fallen into the range of crank opinion, the 2 or 3 percentage points in any opinion poll who will agree to statements such as Joe Biden is a hippopotamus. Women's rights revolution has decreased the rate of rape, for example, by about 75% since the early 1970s when records were first kept. Domestic violence has been in pretty steady decline. Children's rights revolution has seen a decline in the number of American states with corporal punishment and in the victimization of children at school, and the rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse have also been in decline over the last several decades. Okay, well, now it's time for some psychohistory. Why has violence declined over so many scales of time and magnitude? Well, one possibility is that human nature itself has changed and people have somehow lost their inclinations toward violence. Well, I think this is unlikely for a number of reasons. I expect most people in this audience will agree. For one thing, many of the declines of violence that I have shown are far too recent to have been products of Darwinian natural selection, which has a speed limit that's set in generations. So, for example, since 1945, Germany has transitioned from perhaps the most warlike society in human history to the most pacifist society in human history. That hasn't come about because Germans themselves are any biologically different than their grandparents were. The decline of lynching, rape, and spousal abuse, again, over a span of decades, not a span of thousands of years. In the United States, homicide declined by 50% in the 1990s in just 10 years. Since we know that environmental changes were sufficient to cause those declines, the simplest explanation is that they were sufficient to cause all the declines. Also, we still see plenty of violence in children, as Richard Tremblay of the University of Montreal has shown. The most violent life stage in the human life cycle is not late adolescence, but rather it is among 2-year-olds, a majority of whom kick, bite, and punch. As he put it, the reason that 2-year-olds don't kill each other is that we don't give them guns. We also see in humans tremendous pleasure taken in vicarious violence, in murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, hockey. and in the prevalence of homicidal fantasies. A number of social psychologists have posed the following question to samples of people. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? And the results are sobering. About 15% of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And more than 60% of women and 3/4 of men, at least occasionally, fantasize about killing people. What does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that 25% of men are liars. A more likely possibility is that human nature is complex, as I hinted early on. Again, this is the psychohistory. That human nature is always comprised brain systems that incline us toward violence and brain systems that inhibit us from violence, the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored the violence-inhibiting systems. An idea that perhaps we could first attribute to Norbert Elias. So how can we understand the brain systems for violence and nonviolence? Well, crucially, it's brain systems, there is no such thing, I argue, as a single source of aggression and violence. A simple way of appreciating that is just to imagine your own cat and the kinds of violence your cat is capable of. When a cat stalks a prey animal, one kind of violence, it will crouch low and keep absolutely silent and very slowly pad toward the target. On the other hand, when a male non-neutered cat encounters another male cat, and they have a contest for dominance, then they rear up on their legs and they hiss and yowl and screech at each other. And we have reason to believe that these two behaviors, both of which we can call aggression or violence, come from different brain systems. In the book, I actually talk about what those neuroanatomical systems are likely to be. I've skipped that for this talk. So I've skipped the neuroanatomy. I'll just talk about them as separate systems. In particular, I think there are 5 different sources of human violence and 4 sources of nonviolence, and I will go through them quickly. To begin with, we can talk about a system that's sometimes called the rage circuit, where an organism, not excluding humans, when suddenly frustrated or injured or confined, will erupt in a furious struggle, often accompanied by yowls in animals or swearing in humans, a primitive response to pain, fear, and frustration, whose evolutionary function is just to neutralize an immediate threat by startling or intimidating it. In mild forms, there is the form of repair of computer systems that people in tech support call percussive maintenance, as when something goes wrong with your phone or your computer and you're tempted to give it a swat. The extreme form, you get violent outbursts of road rage or and rampages where rioters, sometimes police, will erupt in savage fury after they have been threatened or frustrated. A second form of violence is dominance, the desire to become top dog, alpha male, to climb the pecking order. These are confrontations that of threat and often bluffing to establish relative strength, whereafter the weaker concedes to any contested resource to the stronger, sparing both of them from a physical fight whose outcome would be a foregone conclusion and that could injure both of them in the process. So its function is to allow both sides to avoid the cost of combat when the outcome is predictable. The individual level, we get the contest to become alpha male, often fought out in a process that I will refer to as competitive distance urination. You might be familiar with a different term for it. At the group level, you've got contests for ethnic, racial, national, and religious supremacy. People want their group, not just themselves, to be dominant. A third motive for violence is revenge, which often results in or manifests itself in moralistic violence, where people believe that not only is this form of violence permissible, but it might even be mandatory. Justice must be done. The guilty must be punished. We can't let them get away with it. It's a form of retaliation after harm. As I mentioned, it's sensed to be justified and mandatory. Its obvious function is deterrence. That is, you deter the actual harm doer, specific deterrence, or others like him, general deterrence. Examples are at the individual and small group level, vendettas and blood feuds and rough justice, cruel punishments. At the institutionalized level, that's in a sense what a lot of our criminal justice system does. Then there's just instrumental or exploitative violence, where it's just a means to an end, where a target is disabled or eliminated simply because it's a nuisance. It's an obstacle on the path to something that you want. You may harbor no hatred toward the mouse that you kill in a mousetrap. You just want it gone. Other examples are predation. Again, predators don't hate their prey. Fishermen don't hate their fish. Plunder, conquest. If the natives are occupying land that you want, you eliminate the natives. Rape for sexual motives, and just elimination of rivals and the preemptive removal of threats, all of which could simply be cold, calculated, first-degree violence. Finally, and more complex, we are a cognitive species. We think up belief systems and ideologies, and many of those ideologies that envision a utopia that could come about if only we eliminated the impediments to a perfect world, namely the people who oppose us. Utopian ideologies share a belief in a future world that will be infinitely good forever. Well, if that's your belief system, then not only is violence against the people who stand in your way justified, it's absolutely required, because these are people who are standing in the way of infinite good forever. Therefore, any amount of genocide or murder is justified by the ends surpassing the means. Likewise, if people are opposing you, if they disagree with your ideology, how evil are they? Well, they're standing in the way of an infinitely perpetual, perfect world. You do the math. So that's how you get militant religions that commit terrible atrocities, militant nationalism, Nazism, communism. As I mentioned, if the ends are infinitely good, then the means can be arbitrarily violent and opponents are arbitrarily evil. As captured in the Marxist saying from the 1930s, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, disregarding the fact that people aren't eggs and that there wasn't even a particularly good omelet as the result of all that breaking. Well, that sounds pretty depressing. With 5 different ways in which people can kill each other, how did we manage to bring the rates down? And why don't we see everyone killing everyone else all the time? Well, this brings us to our better angels, the other side of human nature. One of them is self-control. This is the one that was emphasized by Elias, and it has an obvious implementation in psychoanalytic theory as the ego. It's the system probably concentrated in the prefrontal cortex of the brain that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit violent impulses before they erupt in actual behavior. There's empathy. Empathy has a number of senses, but the relevant one here is sympathetic concern. That is a goal or motive to prevent the suffering and enhance the flourishing of other people. Probably the original evolutionary origin was to bond mothers and offspring, but also our close biological kin, our friends, and our allies. Research on empathy shows that it is not an automatic reflex. We don't feel the pain of everyone else by default, but it can be turned on or off, dialed up or down by factors like kinship. People on average are more empathic towards their blood relatives. We're more empathic toward people who are like us, who are in our coalition and working toward the same goal, and who are cute. We tend to feel empathy toward cute little furry baby animals rather than uglier animals or people. However, the circle of empathy can be adjusted, and that's one of the ideas with which I'll end the talk. A third source of inhibition of violence, a third better angel, is our moral sense. Again, in psychoanalytic theory, presumably the closest implementation, at least in classic theory, was the superego, the set of norms and taboos that we have, often centered on intuitions of tribalism, authority, purity, and fairness, which just make certain kind of violence things that you just don't do. A decent person won't go there. Finally, there's reason, cognitive processes, problem solving, objective detached analysis, which can set up violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won, including institutions like the United Nations and peacekeeping forces, systems of criminal justice, anger management, and other ways in which we use our ingenuity to try to reduce violence as a problem. Okay, finally, I've talked a bit about the history. I've talked a bit about the psycho. Now it's time to put them together as psychohistory. That is, what happened over the course of history that brought out our better angels, that as in this famous Rembrandt painting alluding to the biblical story of the binding of Isaac, what angel stayed our hand and knocked the knife out of our hands before it actually resulted in acts of bloodshed. Well, of them, one of them is the Leviathan, the metaphor from Thomas Hobbes of a sovereign or government that keeps us from each other's throats. Again, this relates back to Norbert Elias, who claimed that the strengthening of the ego during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity was facilitated by a centralized system of justice that incentivized inhibiting impulses and taking your disputes to court rather than being the baddest knight in the fiefdom. A state and judicial system with a monopoly on violence can neutralize the incentive for exploitative attack. You don't have to constantly be on edge that your neighbors will invade you, or you won't be tempted to invade them if you think that Leviathan will punish you, and therefore it reduces the need for preemptive attacks, for deterrence and vengeance. And it also circumvents the kind of self-serving biases, the defense mechanisms that all of us harbor, where everyone always thinks that their opponent's aggression are naked assaults out of the blue, and that their own aggression is justified retaliation in return for a prior harm. Well, when both sides believe that, you have a recipe for endless vendettas and cycles of violence and Hatfields and McCoys and Corleones and so on. A second historical force that can bring out our better angels, again, Elias deserves credit for this, is an idea that during the Enlightenment came to be called doux commerce in French, gentle commerce. Whereas plunder is zero-sum, trade is positive-sum. Everybody wins. As technology allows goods and ideas to be exchanged over longer distances among larger groups of people and at lower cost, it becomes cheaper to buy things than to steal them, and other people become more valuable alive than dead. A third historical force has been called by Peter Singer the expanding circle, although the idea goes back to Darwin. Namely, human sympathy, as I mentioned, is elastic. It is not a brute reflex. By default, we apply it to family, friends, and allies, but over the course of history, you can see the circle expanding from the village to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, to other races, both sexes, to children, and perhaps we're seeing the beginning of that being expanded to other species. What expanded the circle? The forces of and technologies of cosmopolitan are an obvious candidate as we travel, as we consume more history, more literature and drama, more journalism. People then begin to adopt the vantage point of others, whether real or fictitious, and that studies have shown tends to expand your sympathetic concern toward people like that. Finally, the fact that we've been getting smarter, that as literacy and education and public discourse expand, people get into the habit of thinking more abstractly and universally. That encourages them to rise above their parochial vantage point. It makes it harder to privilege your own interests over others just because I'm me and you're not. You can step back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence and increasingly see it as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. If I'm right that there are 4 different historical processes that seem to empower our better angels, you can ask, well, isn't that kind of unparsimonious? Do they have anything in common? Why should we be so lucky that 4 different historical forces push in the same direction? And I end the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, suggesting this may not be a coincidence, that violence is what game theorists call a social dilemma. That is, there's always a temptation to be an aggressor and exploit a victim, but the damage done to the victim is always greater than the benefit accruing to the aggressor. So in the long run, since aggressors could become victims over the course of history and vice versa, we're really all better off if somehow we could figure out how to avoid violence on all sides. The dilemma, of course, is how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time that you do? Because if you turn your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his as swords, well, you could find yourself at the wrong end of an invasion or assault. One could very well speculate that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually solved this problem, just as we have dealt with other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. And the common denominator behind the 4 historical forces is that all of them increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence at the same time. And that's why, just to conclude, I've suggested in a subsequent book that the decline of violence is part of a larger historical trend of human progress. We have expanded life, health, education, safety, human rights. That has been a theme of the subsequent book, Enlightenment Now. I will. With that, I will conclude and take your questions. I hope you found it stimulating. Thank you again for having me.
We have one comment in the chat box. Should we start with that? And then we have another one. We'll start with the first one. Eva, was it? That's Eva. Sorry, where are we? Eva Fogelman. Eva, Ina, do you want to read them? Because
I think Eva can ask the question, yes.
Okay, but understood that we only have like about 15 minutes.
Okay,
so.
All right, yes. How do you account for the increased rate of Palestinian citizens of Israel, 2 million inhabitants in Israel, not beyond the Green Line, killing each other in domestic violence or gang wars, 79 killings since January as opposed to last year?
So I was not aware of that recent trend. There is in a number of cultures, including many Arab communities, but also in the south of the United States and in many parts of the world, what's sometimes called a culture of honor, where this is a common dynamic in human history, where it's considered to be mandatory to avenge any insult. In many cultures, this also involves the potential poaching or sexual freedom of women with violence. And in the absence of an effective system of justice, then the local morality can then stoke cycles of vengeance for vengeance for vengeance for vengeance. You see this in the American frontier, the Wild West, in the Scottish Highlands, in the mountainous areas of Sicily that gave rise to mafias, in American inner cities, and in many Muslim communities, that a culture of honor can often lead to escalating cycles of violence. They're a risk factor for violence, and they often tend to get out of control in zones of anarchy where people can't avail themselves of the police and the criminal justice system, and they have to take justice into their own hands. That would be my first guess, and I don't know how effective the Israeli police force and court system are at mediating disputes within the communities of Israeli Arabs. If it's ineffective, that just opens the door to people settling disputes in their own hands through violence, and that can drive violence rates up in a hurry.
Thank you so much. So the next question from Thomas Gowlick. Would you expect an increase in violence from people who no longer subscribe to the, in quotes, everyone wins from commerce, end of quote, narrative, but who instead hold beliefs like, quote, trade in harmful is harmful because it promotes global warming, end of quote?
Absolutely. That those who have a zero-sum view of the world, that is, that who don't understand the fact that exchange makes both parties better off, but who see commerce, trade as forms of exploitation, will naturally try to claw back any kind of gains that the other side has, as opposed to maximizing the joint benefit. That, for example, has been a cause of a lot of anti-Semitic violence and violence against middlemen, minorities all over the world, where if exchange, trade, commerce, investment are seen as exploitative, well, you punish the exploiters, the skimmers. Likewise, on the world stage, if you have a zero-sum mindset, as, for example, Vladimir Putin clearly does, where there's just a clash of civilizations and the success of the West comes at the expense of Eurasian civilization, well, then it's just a question of who's the exploiter and who's the exploited, and let's just ourselves not become the exploiter. So absolutely, and moreover, if what counts in these equations is not just material prosperity, but national glory or religious fulfillment, or other kind of nebulous things that don't actually pertain to health and happiness and bringing up kids and so on, but the glory of the civilization, that's another huge incentive toward violence, because you can sacrifice the well-being of humans if the reward comes in terms of greatness, glory, honor, and so on. So yes, I think the idea that the rejection of the idea that positive sum cooperation is possible is a contributor to violence.
Thank you very much. The next one is from Mark Andre Cotton. My question is, how does violence in education and trauma repetition fit into your presentation of violence? I'm thinking about the dissociative mechanism that allow abuse in childhood, for instance, and lead to trauma, repetition, and social violence. I'm struck about the irrationality that permeates violent reenactment.
Yeah, so there is certainly violence is correlated across generations, and here I'm going to, I think I'm something of a heretic or a skeptic of the common trauma narrative. The problem with a lot of studies that show that children who've experienced violence themselves grow up to be violent is they don't have controls for genetic relatedness. Parents might mistreat children, but it could be that violent parents give birth to violent children, and that the correlation across generations just comes from heritability. Unless the same correlations are found between adoptive parents and their children. You just don't know how much of it is reenactment or just the fact that violent parents tend to have violent kids. For that matter, kids who are obstreperous, who are defiant in the first place, if they have parents with any kind of tendency toward violence, they're more likely to become the victims of violence, to trigger their parents. And so there's a lot in that dynamic that I realize this is an unpopular belief that I think we might misattribute to reenactment, but it might be better explained by heritability, which is not to exculpate parents for abusing children. That's a horrible crime and it ought to be minimized. We've made some progress, but there's still much more to be made. But I personally, this is an idea that I develop at greater length in my book, The Blank Slate, in the chapter on children.
Thank you very much. Now, Doris Lecher is asking, do you expect a regression in peacefulness with climate change and resource depletion?
Well, I don't think I'm skeptical that there's going to be resource depletion. The problem that there used to be fears that we'd run out of oil. We should be so lucky. There's more oil than we know what to do with. And likewise, when resources become scarce, they become more expensive. And so people are incentivized to be more clever at mining them or to find substitutes or to recycle them. So I think resource shortages are a red herring. Climate change clearly is not. And we don't know at present how bad it will get. It will certainly get bad, but it's also possible that we'll avoid the worst outcomes. In fact, the catastrophic outcomes seem less likely. I mean, according to the latest IPCC. But even though it is undoubtedly true that climate change will cause a lot of waste and a lot of suffering in vulnerable parts of the world, it's not automatic that it will lead to more violence. That people tend not to fight over resources that can be divided, like water. The majority of wars are fought out of deterrence, of vengeance, of honor, there are actually not a whole lot of wars that are fought over diminishing resources, at least not in the last 70 years or so. So while I think it's mandatory to take measures that reduce global warming, I don't think that they will necessarily lead to an increase in war.
Thank you very much. I think next was Sally Weintraub. You used the hand raising, and I think you're right now in the queue.
And then Ina, after that, we need to hear from Michael Rahili, who had his hand up. I mean, who was in the queue also. But Sally first. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Really expanded my overall conception, and actually it's a very needed antidote and hopeful picture. Thank you profoundly. I'm more worried about the climate emergency, which was the subject of my talk. 2 days ago, the BBC announced that we are due to hit 1.5 degrees within the next 4 years, 2027. And this is the critical IPCC figure from 2009 that was put as, you know, the real red line. And so I think that, and one of the kinds of violence that I was wondering what you thought about was slow violence. You know, the violence actually talked about by Rob Nixon, the violence that accumulates but is actually just as violent. And that's one point. The other thing is that I very much am interested in your situating the different sources of violence. And in my talk, I was arguing that actually predatory violence is really on the up and is driving the climate emergency. So it is something to really pay attention to. Anyway, so I was intersecting with what you were saying in those sorts of ways.
Yes, a few things. Yeah, we're clearly going to blow by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by the way, that red line has been reduced for many years. The red line was 2 degrees Celsius. It was lowered, I think, just to try to urge the world into action. I personally think that that was counterproductive because there's just no way that we're going to keep it to 1.5 degrees. It's been already 1.2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And I think having a completely impossible target is just not the way you motivate people to action. People just say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's not have kids. The world's going to end by 2050. Let's enjoy ourselves while we can. So I actually think it was a mistake to lower that red line. I don't think there is a red line. That is the, I mean, there could be tipping points, but the latest estimates suggest that the hotter things are, the worse things get. There is, I think, an imperative to mitigate it as much as possible. At the same time, since some of it is going to happen, as you said, there's no way we're going to keep below 1.5 degrees. That's impossible. We've also got to think about how to cope with the warming that's going to occur while reducing it as much as we can. This is a whole set of issues in which I have taken a stance, probably best discussed elsewhere, but I'll just throw it out for those of you who are curious. I don't think we can solve the climate emergency without a considerable expansion of nuclear power. Not everyone agrees with that. I don't think we're going to get the world to reduce its hunger for energy. Quite the contrary, especially in the developing world. People are going to be as ravenous for energy as we have been in the West. And so the way to mitigate the climate emergency is to develop technologies that make clean energy cheaper than dirty energy, and that means abundant carbon-free energy. But anyway, that's my opinion on climate change expressed elsewhere. I think slow violence is actually a useless category. It's just a metaphorical way of trying to demonize things that you don't like by calling them violence. That there are lots of bad things in the world. They're not all violence, and that we should clarify our understanding by restricting our words to cohesive, coherent phenomena. And I've been asked many times, isn't advertising a form of violence? Isn't obesity a form of violence? Isn't capitalism a form of violence? And the answer is no, that violence, if we want to understand the way the world works, let's choose our words to refer to things. Violence would be the application of deliberate application of force that harms another individual. Do I think that predatory violence as a result of climate change is on the increase? I'm not sure what you're referring to, because there certainly have been upticks in predatory violence, such as Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There's been an uptick in violent crime, including homicide in the United States, though I think most of that is not predatory, but dominance and revenge, namely gang warfare, drug gangs, and so on. So I'm not sure what which trend, which data set you're alluding to in the increase.
In brief, I'm talking about the mass sowing of doubt and disavowal by the oil industry, and it's spread through culture to basically cause delay in moving to renewables. And I don't see the 1.5 degree level as in quite the same way that you do. Climate scientists think we are already in deep trouble with the climate, and we're only just reaching that level. So anyway, but predatory violence is deliberately sowing climate denialism to lead people to not take it seriously enough. Yeah.
I agree that disinformation and distortions are bad and ought to be countered. I don't think it's useful to lump that together with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, with rape, with gang violence in American inner cities. Not all bad things have the same cause, and I think we just confuse ourselves if we lump them together with one word that's mainly designed to express our moral disapproval of that category. Now, moral disapproval is appropriate. I don't think that that corporations or anyone else should obfuscate the seriousness of climate. I just don't think that we understand anything any better by calling it predatory violence. Also, there is legitimate room for disagreement as to whether renewables by themselves are the solution to the climate crisis. I don't think they are. which is not to deny that the climate crisis is a crisis and that we ought to combat it. But if we do, I argue that we have to do the math. We have to figure out how much energy the world needs and will demand, how we can supply that energy without poisoning the atmosphere. Personally, the data that I've seen suggests that renewables aren't going to close that gap. But where we do agree is that we ought to think very seriously about it, that the consequences could result in considerable harm. Again, as you note, we're not going to stick to 1.5 degrees. We're absolutely going to blow by it, and that's going to be bad. It's not going to lead to the extinction of the species, but it can still be bad, and we should try to keep it as low as possible. 1.5 is not going to happen, but let's try to keep it below 2.
Thank you so much. So the next question is from Brian. I have a question about the military-industrial complex, he says. Brian?
Yeah, Michael Rahili was in the queue before me. Is he, if he's still here?
him.
Yes,
don't
I'm still
see
here.
him.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Brian. So my question is about compassion and your 4 better angels brain systems. And I'm wondering if you see, if you're, I imagine you're familiar with compassion and the research on compassion.
Well, this is what I call the empathy or sympathy. But yes, compassion would be one of the second
Yes.
4 better angels. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking of compassion, and this is my question to you, as possibly activating more than just the second empathy system, but possibly activating reason as well.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And in fact, empathy in the sense of putting yourself into someone's shoes and trying to feel what they feel is not, you're right, is not synonymous with compassion. I can be concerned about the well-being of others without actually imagining what it's like to be them. And I would agree, assuming this is the direction of your question, that it's actually compassion that we want to maximize rather than empathy.
Yeah.
And just to be concrete, just for those of, I'm going to guess, Michael, what you have in mind, why they're not the same, because I have found that there's a tendency to equate them, but they're not the same thing. So, for example, I can't possibly empathize with, say, the pain of childbirth or with the pain of being a sexual assault victim. I mean, I could try, but there's no way that I can imagine what it's like. Nor can I literally empathize with a billion Chinese. I don't have the time. I don't have the mental flexibility. On the other hand, I think it's a really, really good idea that they all flourish, that they, as few of them as possible, suffer, as an ideal that I feel is justified. Whether or not I actually emotionally feel it, I don't think people should be murdered. I think they should be healthy. I think they should be happy. I think they should be safe. So that's a kind of compassion. I care about their well-being, whether or not I vicariously experience it. I'm not sure if that's the direction you're going.
Yes, yes. And that by feeling the compassion, it's a little less emotional, where possibly it's easier for us to act because we're not getting so tied up in our own personal emotions.
So I couldn't agree more. And that is an argument that I advance in Better Angels of our nature. For those of you who want to see that argument really developed, a former student and collaborator of mine, Paul Bloom at the University of Toronto, has a book with a somewhat cheeky title, Against Empathy.
Now, I read that, and that's where I was going with it.
That takes it to that pushes the argument as far as it can go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian is next.
Yes, and Ina, I'm wondering if we could extend this session by maybe 10 minutes since the next session is a break.
We can extend if Dr. Pinker will.
If Dr. Pinker is willing to stay.
Yes, I think I'm just going to check my calendar, but I think I'm okay. Yeah. Let's see. Yes, I can.
Okay, fabulous. So my question is about the military-industrial complex. And it's an interesting paradox to me. First of all, I think that everything that you've said about the decline of violence is a blast of fresh air. but there's an interesting paradox here, which is that even as the violence itself has declined, the money spent on war preparations has increased. And it's increased throughout the 20th century. Right now, at this point, the United States is spending nearly $1 trillion a year on war preparations. Now, that $1 trillion, if it were put into wind, geothermal, and nuclear, for that matter, as you said, if we invested those resources in creating a sustainable future, we wouldn't have a climate crisis. But I'm wondering, what do you think could account for this fact that, one of the answers is that it's institutional inertia of military bureaucracies, of defense contractors. So, we have certain institutions to thank for this, but it just strikes me as a tremendous disconnect that as the violence, even though the violence has declined, the money spent on war preparations has continued to increase.
Yeah, well, just a slight modification. It has increased, although, and I have this graph in Better Angels, as a proportion of GDP, it has decreased over the course of the 20th century, or at least since World War II, although it has started to creep back up in the last couple of decades. But we're actually spending less as a percentage of GDP than we did during the Cold War. You're right that there is a paradox, and that there is, actually, maybe it's not a paradox, because we are seeing in the last year and a half the call for arming Ukraine, and we're kind of grateful for our stockpiles, and perhaps in many European countries regretting the fact that they don't have greater stockpiles to repel this naked aggression. The problem, I certainly would not deny that part of the problem is the fact that the military contractors are effective Washington lobbyists, and that they can kind of blackmail politicians into supporting greater expenditures, probably greater than we objectively need. But the problem is, as long as the other guy is arming himself, you can't be the only one not to be armed in the neighborhood. And so the solution is no more weaponry than necessary, but ideally it's to convince the other guy of the same thing. And the reason that military expenditures as a proportion of GDP went down was that the Cold War ended. And so there was less, it became sillier and sillier to have massive battalions of tanks in Europe, for example, to repel a Soviet invasion that wasn't going to happen. On the other hand, now we've seen that there is a Russian invasion that did happen, and sadly, that's going to lead in the other direction, probably a greater percentage of military expenditure. So the problem is not so much how do we convince our own politicians of the folly of wasting money on weapons when it could be put to many other uses, which I completely agree to. But it's really got to be Putin and Xi that agree. And the challenge, which is much harder than getting our own politicians to see the wisdom of that, is to get Putin and Xi to see the wisdom of that. That would make it much easier for us to disarm.
Right, but I just want to say that Russia spends less than 3% of the US and NATO combined on military.
3%?
Less than 3%, yes, or about 3%.
A much higher percentage of its GDP than because it's much smaller.
Right, but the objective military capabilities that you can buy with every dollar, are, there's just no comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who's next, Ina?
Rachel Yodelman. Maybe I will read. Okay, so Rachel is asking, among other things, Dr. Pinker says that reading and identification with fictional characters and the like leads to increased capacity. Okay, I lost my chat. 1 second. Sorry. To increase capacity for sympathy for others. What about changes over history in child rearing? How has that influenced human behavior?
Yeah, so it's hard to, certainly there have been changes in child rearing, and I have a chapter on the children's rights revolution in the Better Angels of Our Nature. a lot of that research, perhaps not surprisingly, came from psychoanalytic traditions, and because child rearing was given such a big role in the formation of personality and adult conflict resolution. There's only been a correlation that as wars have declined and blood feuds and slavery, so have many harsh methods of child rearing, corporal punishment of children and other forms of abuse. We don't know that it's the child rearing practices that caused the violence reduction as adults, or whether they're both part of a general realization that violence is something that on moral and practical grounds ought to be avoided, ought to be minimized. We just don't have, as we have less of a taste for harming other people, that'll include spanking and doing worse to children. I think a good quantitative econometrician or social scientist could see whether, say, changes in child rearing at time one lead to reductions in, say, homicide or assault or rape at time two, or for that matter, declarations of war and other bellicose ideas. I don't know of research that shows that child rearing is the cause of the decline of violence as opposed to one of its manifestations.
Thank you. And also she continues, why would authors begin to write sympathetic portrayals of fictional characters? That didn't happen till the 18th century or so.
Yeah, it's a really good question. That is this just kind of begging the question, substituting one mystery for another? It's I can only speculate, because it is a good question. One of them is that as there's more travel, as people spend more time in cities, rubbing shoulders with people unlike them, then it's harder to demonize people that you deal with day to day. Perhaps the growth of commerce also contributed to that. Perhaps the growth of reason, where when you for people who are well-educated, well-read, when you read about other cultures that are as devoted to their practices as we are to them, when you consume history and you realize that many of practices we take for granted today were unthinkable in the past, but there was change, you get a kind of perspective that maybe elevates you from your own egocentric vantage point, and you start to see that other people have interests and opinions that are equivalent to one's own. Maybe that would lead the better read and more cosmopolitan people to then deliberately create characters unlike those of their readership in order to express the idea that deep down we're more similar than naive experience would suggest. So this would be all part of the process of enlightenment, both intellectual, emotional, experiential, of universalizing experience, of becoming more humanistic, less parochial, less tribal, less egocentric.
Thank you. I think next one is David Lauder. He's raising his hand, and then more from Rachel if we have time.
Stephen, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the possible relationship between violence, the level of violence, and population, overpopulation, or population growth.
Yeah, I think that's it was a common view of the 70s, but I don't think there's a strong connection that because a lot of warfare and violence isn't over resources, because you can figure out ways of growing more crops in the same amount of land. You can buy what you don't grow yourself. And we have seen that advances in agronomy have more than compensated for advances for growth of population, that the massive worldwide famines that Paul Ehrlich predicted in the 1970s didn't happen. And populous countries and cities are not necessarily more violent, that you can have large countries that have relatively low rates of homicide, that don't engage in war, and sparsely populated mountainous areas where you've got, like Appalachia, like Scottish Highlands, like the mountainous regions of Southeast Asia, where there's constant warring and feuding, and there just aren't that many people. But the ones that are there will fight over over pigs, over women, over the land that they do have. Whereas you have huge cities like Hong Kong, where everyone lives in peace, or densely populated parts of the world like the Netherlands. So I tend to think that population is a red herring.
Thank
Ina,
you
I
so
think-
much. And
I
the
think this is
last
going to have to be the
question,
last. Yeah.
maybe the last question from the youngest, I think, member of our group, Joey Epstein. He's asking, what are your thoughts on the development of AI as being an enhancer to human life, but also becoming a multinational intelligent arms race? AI evolution could lead to a simpler and more productive way of life for humans and improve the human capacity for information, but the technology could soon surpass human planning and forethought. It could also lead to war. How do you see this playing out policy-wise? Congress held a meeting yesterday with big AI CEO. The psychoanalytic causes to AI's emergence and its future, and as well as if you see an East-West militaristic game theory dilemma on the horizon. Say China continues development without sanctions and America freezes or slows development. Thank you, and it was a privilege listening.
Thank you. Well, you've already laid out a lot of the issues, and the spurts in the technology are so recent that we honestly don't know how it's going to play out. But you've laid out many of the promises of artificial intelligence, which I think are enormous. Of the scenarios that have been raised, I personally am skeptical of the worst fear that it's an existential threat to our species, that AI will try to wipe us out, will try to subjugate us, will consume us as raw materials. I lay out that argument in Enlightenment Now for those who are interested. Also, let's not confuse metaphorical arms races, such as the competition for the best AI technology between countries, with real arms races, where you're actually building weapons that are designed to destroy people and cities. That if it's a metaphorical arms race as to who gets the best AI, that could benefit humanity by egging everyone on. I don't, among the risks which are serious, including industrial scale disinformation and confusion and fraud, I don't think that war itself is particularly likely one of them.
Dr. Pinker, Dr. Steven Pinker, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Been a pleasure.
This was
you
immensely
so much.
stimulating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.